One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. The Treasurer knows.
I want an economy that works for people, not the other way around.
We'll just end up being a third-rate economy, a banana republic.
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast that explains big economic issues in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today we're bringing you a conversation from our popular webinar series. Today, you'll hear from two former presidents of the Pacific Island nations of Kiribati and Palau, former President Anote Tong and former President Tommy E. Remengesau Jr. We spoke to them as part of the Regional Climate Diplomacy Forum, which the Australia Institute hosted for a second time in partnership with the Pacific Elders Voice and the Edmund Rice Centre. Pacific Island nations are on the front line of climate change, and as Australia celebrates the passage of the 43% climate bill, Pacific leaders want to know that the new Australian government's improved rhetoric on climate change is matched by actual policy integrity when it comes to new gas and coal projects and exports. This was recorded live on Tuesday the 13th of September 2022, and things may have changed since recording. I know a number of friends from the Pacific Island nations are tuning in. Thank you for joining us as well. Richard, over to you.
Thanks, Ebony, and it's a real privilege today to welcome our two guests. Let me start by introducing my old friend, President Anote Tong. President Tong was president of Kiribati for a constitutional maximum of 3 terms between 2003 and 2016. And during that time, he played an incredible role, not just within Kiribati and the Pacific, but around the world, highlighting the existential threat of climate change to low-lying island states like Kiribati. I was very fortunate to get to know President Tong in the lead up to the Paris Climate Convention back in 2015, when the Australia Institute and he worked closely together on what was then the No New Coal Mines campaign, which culminated in President Tong writing to literally every world leader in the lead up to Paris, asking them to support his call, and in turn the Pacific's call, for a ban on old new coal mines. It's a simple idea now. I assure you it was radical back in the day, back when everyone was obsessed with percentages and complicated accounting. To ask for something so simple, for the small number of coal exporting countries to stop building coal mines, was radical. But while it was great when we saw other Pacific leaders step in, and it was great when Sir Nicholas Stern signed up, there was real excitement in Australia when former Wallabies captain David Pocock went on to be one of the first to endorse the call, which of course made it front page news in Australia. So thank you for being here in Australia, still doing your advocacy, President Tong. It's also my great privilege to introduce former president of Palau, Tommy Remengesau Jr. He was also a 16-year president of Palau. It's just incredible that we have people in Australia who have such heritage from their community speaking truth to Australian power about these issues. Not only did he show strong leadership in his own country and around the world when it came to environment and climate issues, he was actually given the UN's one of their top accolades, the Champion of the Earth Award, for his work. So thank you both for being here in Australia, telling not just our audience today, but so many of our parliamentarians, what the truth of climate inaction looks like in your communities and, of course, around the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Joining the presidents today is the director of the Australia Institute's Climate and Energy Program, and joining me right next to me here in the office, former climate negotiator as well, Richie Merzian. Anote, Tong, Tommy Remengesau Jr., thank you so much for joining us today. President Tong, if I can start with you and take you back to the Paris Agreement that Richard was talking about there. You wrote to every single world leader back in 2015 telling them that the construction of each new coal mine undermines the spirit and intent of any agreement that we may reach, particularly in the upcoming COP21 in Paris, while stopping new coal mine construction now will make any agreement reached in Paris truly historical. Did we end up missing out on making Paris a historical moment, and are we any closer now to a global moratorium on new coal mines?
First of all, let me acknowledge the elders of the land, and of course, as we embark on this interaction, we seek the blessings of the elders, past, present, and emerging, and we seek their guidance and blessing in our endeavors, the mission that we are on this occasion. With respect to that question, it's the agreement in Paris itself was historical. I think not many of us really believed that we could ever reach agreement, especially after the Copenhagen experience. So Paris was truly historical. But at the same time, I think there were always this underlying hiccups. Okay, there were countries that were not really committed. But of course, in terms of the coal, I recall being in Bonn and going off to Germany to see that the coal was still being mined in Germany. Now, the question really, are we any closer to banning or not stopping any digging up any of coal? Regrettably, no. And I think that is the sad reality of what we still face. The aspirations of what we came away from Paris with are no longer, we're not any closer to achieving those. And I think we can blame many things, including the pandemic, but it doesn't look like we'll be meeting those targets which we set in 2015. And we're not looking like we will be able to meet the less than 1.5 degree rise in global temperature, which is truly unfortunate, especially for those of us, the countries on the front line of climate change. And so we need to relook at that, at what we're doing with coal. We need to re-examine what it means and the implications for not just for countries like ours in the Pacific, but for humanity as a whole.
The UNFCCC accounting doesn't really require countries like Australia to take responsibility for the emissions of their exported fossil fuels, but legal responsibility is quite different to moral responsibility. Is it a country's, whether it's Australia or any other large exporter of fossil fuels, is it their moral responsibility to deal with, or at the very least acknowledge the ramifications of their exported fossil fuel emissions?
Well, we must go back to the origins of that legal regime, the international legal regime, which set up that agreed that the exported coal you're not accountable for the emissions from that. Who designed those laws? Okay, I understand and I'm aware that it's the accounting for is very complicated, and for small countries like ours in the Pacific, we don't have the capacity to be able to negotiate on an equal basis with the countries that really are the ones that want to perpetuate what is going on. But let's just be simple, okay? It doesn't take a lot of intelligence to know that when we are talking about the global level emission, which is what is driving global temperature, what is driving sea level to rise, it is not whether you export it or burn it at home. It's got to be, it's the total aggregate of what is being spilled out into the atmosphere. And I do not understand how you can say that you are only responsible for the emissions which you burn at home when you are a huge exporter of fossil fuel, in particular coal, and subscribing to the emissions of those countries to whom you export. I think it's got to be well understood that it's about the global level of emission, including both domestic emissions and those which you export as a country, from which you derive revenue and benefits. Okay, you are deriving, and you cannot reject responsibility when you are deriving benefits from that. And so, no, I believe that we must take a more moral, if that is what and maybe turn the moral obligation, as we call it, into a more binding legal arrangement. I think this is what's sadly missing.
Yeah, certainly there's not much in the way of legal ramifications or bindings at the moment. Richie, I know the Australia Institute has undertaken polling about this issue. What did it find?
Yeah, so the Australian Institute just picked one electorate in Australia, which was the electorate of Boothby in Adelaide, which went from being a Liberal Party seat to a Labor Party seat at the last election, and actually asked those voters, do you think countries have a responsibility, some responsibility for the pollution from Australia's gas and coal burnt overseas? And the majority did believe that there was some responsibility to be had. And when we also asked them, well, what should countries do about it at the next UN climate conference, which will take place in Egypt in November, the majority agreed that world leaders should agree to stop new coal mines. And so we're seeing right now something that President Tong was pushing ahead of the Paris Climate Agreement really take more resonance now in mainstream climate conversations. And this is, I guess, a broader shift that we saw in 2022. Both presidents just have been briefing numerous politicians in Canberra, including a number of the politicians, the independents who won on strong climate agendas. And there is a newfound interest in addressing a far more wider remit of Australia's responsibility on climate, not just the narrow legal responsibility, but also the responsibility that comes from profiting from selling the problem.
Mm-hmm.
President Remengesau, you have a long history in multilateral efforts to address, in particular, the environment and oceans. What are you hoping world leaders will achieve at the upcoming UN climate conference in Egypt?
First of all, thank you. I'm happy to be here, and I join my colleague in also extending my respect and honor to the elders, both present and past of this homeland. And first of all, I'm hoping that the people come to the table with honesty and really a stronger commitment to get things done, because we've done talking. We've gone way beyond what needs to be done, and there's just not enough action to back our commitments and what we need to do. When it comes to climate change, as we all know, we cannot talk about climate change without addressing the ocean, and vice versa. So for a reminder that for those islands of the Pacific, we're only 1% land and 99% ocean. So the ocean is really where the impact comes and affects the people, our culture, our traditions, our livelihood, our economy, and our sustainable future. So it has to be addressed. The ocean has to be addressed. What do we need to do about the ocean? At the very least, the 30% commitment for all nations to conserve and preserve 30% of their ocean has got to materialize as soon as possible. And there's a tendency, I know we just touched on it, the legal responsibility are actually loopholes that finds an excuse for people and countries to continue to do the things that they're doing and must stop. So I'm really hoping that this next climate conference begins to apply the integrity of the actions they need to take, and really, as has been said, the moral responsibility. Because otherwise, we're really not addressing what science is telling us. We're not addressing the everyday life of the people. You go to Palau or Kiribati or any islands of the Pacific, the ocean acidification is a reality. There's coral bleaching that are destroying our reefs. There's a tremendous frequency of stormy weathers, including typhoons and earthquakes. There's the sea level rise that are affecting the livelihood and relocation of our people. So it doesn't matter where the emission of the greenhouse gas is happening, whether in the Pacific or in Australia. It's happening around the world, and the impact is affecting us small island nations of the Pacific. So at the very least, I'm hoping that the conference really begin to do the right thing to do and bridge the gap between what has been said and what needs to be done. Becoming a repetition, I should say, of stating the problem, but not enough actions and the solutions.
Just sticking with oceans for a little while, President Remengesau, you've talked there about some of the impacts of ocean acidification and sea level rise. I just wondered if you could give us a bit more detail of that. Australia obviously is a coastal nation, but I imagine we're nowhere near as reliant on our oceans as the Pacific Islands are, nor are we seeing as much as people in the Pacific Islands would be experiencing these direct impacts of the changes in climate right now. You talked about sea level rise forcing people to move, but also affecting crops and things like that. What are some of the practical impacts that your people are already experiencing?
Well, the practical impacts is that it's becoming very costly for the government to deal with this. We have to borrow money from the development banks to address these things. And at the rate we're going, we're not going to be able to pay the debts, let alone address the problems that needs to be done. So yes, it's not just the ocean that's being affected. It's the El Nino and the La Nina impacts on our people that really needs partnership. It needs financing. It needs technology. It needs the people to step up on their responsibilities. And I think that's the message we are also putting out, that we're a family from the Pacific. And when you say family, it includes Australia as the big brother. So how do we approach this as a family? Australia has so much to contribute in its leadership role, not only on financing, but on contacts and providing the voice that is needed to be heard from beyond and across, not only across, but beyond the Pacific. So that's the reality. And it makes us even more worried when the security discussions these days are really about defense and military geopolitical considerations, where the heart and soul of the people are not on climate change, which is the true security of our people. So if we are going to survive, we have to put more efforts into what is being done and step up forward.
This is a question for both of you, but first to you, President Tong. Climate finance will be a major point of contention at the upcoming climate conference. Should wealthy countries like Australia be scaling up its financial contributions? And more specifically, can I ask about the Green Climate Fund? I know Australia pulled out of that in the past, and I think we're the only wealthy country now that's not contributing to that main climate fund. How important is climate finance?
Okay, we have allocated the answers to the questions between us, but let me touch on it. And of course, my colleague will just add on what he... Australia, I think, has been reneging on a lot of what the other global members of the global community, the developed members of the global community have been contributing. And I think that was a deliberate decision by your own former administration, I guess. And so Australia is well short of what it needed to do. And of course, as one of the countries, Australia is by far the biggest development partner that we have. And there is a tendency to rebrand what was the existing development assistance into climate finance, okay? We need to be careful that we don't do this, and we must not be confused, because these are different, okay? What needs to be understood is, apart from the development capital that we need in terms in order to undertake our development, we are also now having to deal with the ever-increasing impacts of climate change. And so that will get worse, and it would need additional resources on top of what already has been provided. And so whether that comes through the Green Climate Fund or another vehicle, I think the reality is, yes, we will need additional finance. And the question is, should countries like Australia and other countries who have the capacity to do it provide it? I believe so. I think it's not really asking for more. We're just asking to do what we are losing. In other words, compensation for the damages that we are suffering, not just now, but into the future. I'm sure my colleague would like to add to that.
Yeah, I think the stark and troubling point is Australia is the only wealthy country that is not contributing to the United Nations Climate Fund. And so this is something we hope Australia can return to the table and be a leadership on this particular climate financing that is needed. And secondly, I think the message that we're also bringing is that we can pursue win-win situation for Australia and for the Pacific in the areas of renewable energy. This is something that can really make a big difference for island governments and island communities, while at the same time also good for the people of Australia, as has been indicated by Richie in the public opinions as to how we should be dealing with the alternatives that are available. And then we also want to bring to the tables the fact that it's not just climate financing, but perhaps public-private partnerships in these ventures. There is so much that the leadership of Australia, the United States, Japan, and all, they can also promote investments on the islands on renewable energy. And so the island countries won't find it necessary to go and lend money from developing banks, like Asian development banks or the World Bank, to do these things that are needed. You know, power generation is one of the most expensive cost of running a government right now using fossil fuel. And solar energy is free. The renewable other objectives are there. Why not have a partnership of governments and private sector and the capital necessary to come to the islands, do the infrastructure, and get their money back in a time period that we can all agree on. But again, this is the leadership that the big countries needs to take. Australia, United States, and Japan. And I keep saying it's not just a matter of grants and give the islands more money, but invest in the private sector, support the private sector developments, because somebody is going to step in and do that outside of the family. And I think you know what I mean. Somebody stepping up to do what the family needs to do for themselves.
Yeah. Speaking of the United States, President Biden is hosting the first US Pacific Island Country Summit later this month. We have seen a high level of engagement from the new Australian government within days of taking over, and again with Prime Minister Albanese's attendance at the Pacific Islands Forum. What do you make of the new Australian government's engagement and interest, President Tong?
Well, it's very clear. I think it was made very clear at the forum meeting that Australia is here to be a part of the Pacific region again. It's part of the family. We've learned, of course, the commitment on the climate is something that's obviously welcomed by the Pacific Island countries. We have over the last few days witnessed the passing of the legislation on that, which is very welcome. And so Australia is now really seen as wanting to participate again, to be a part of the family that perhaps it was taken for granted for quite some time in the past. And now it's a time to renew relationships. And I think we welcome that. The question will be, how will this be taken in the context of what's already also happening in the region? There are new partners wanting to be a part of the Pacific Island process. And so it would be said that there is now competition, okay? And it's a concern, I'm sure, for Australia, for some of the Pacific Island countries. It's a welcome new focus of attention. We share many things in common with Australia. We share the democratic system of government. We are modeled on our former colonial past, okay? And so most of us have that. And so we have tended to stay together with Australia, New Zealand, and the former Commonwealth countries. And so the question would be, is the renewed engagement by Australia, what is it being driven by? And how far will that commitment go? Because there is very strong competition coming in from China, and we must not beat around the issue, because that is a new player in town, and they are a very serious new player. And of course, it will have an impact on the focus on what is the most critical security issue for the region, which is climate change, not the competition between the superpowers. And one of the messages we want to deliver while here is, okay, we know this is going on, but let it not distract us from the main issue, which is the climate challenge. And so in this context, Australia, is it gone far enough? And I think we go back to the emission levels. And I think I repeat the same message again. What is Australia committing to via the legislation is still short of what the science says needs to be done in order that we will survive beyond 2060, because we have been given, according to the sixth assessment report of the IPCC, beyond 2060, countries like ours may not be habitable. And the question is Australia doing enough to avoid that? And I think we know the answer to that. Unless there is more stepping up of deeper cuts in emission, including exported emissions, I don't think we're going to survive that.
Yeah, it's a grim reminder of exactly what is at stake. Australia has put up its hand to host a United Nations climate conference, which it would like to do in partnership with Pacific Island nations. I guess I'll ask you both, what would Pacific nations look for in a partner like Australia? And how important do you think this would be to, I guess, put some more pressure on Australia to really lift its game? Obviously, we've got a new government that's more interested in climate, but as you've both outlined, we're not adequately meeting what the science demands. So, what would Pacific nations look for in a partner like Australia to co-host a COP?
I'm looking forward to Australia and the Pacific hosting the COP and not be embarrassed of ourselves. We have to do our responsibility as host, and we would like to be a positive example to the rest of the world that we're hosting, because we have done some meaningful changes. We have done some meaningful work that makes us want to share those results with the rest of the world and to seek the partnership of the rest of the world to what we're doing. Because things can, as they continue like now, I wouldn't want to host something, invite somebody to my home, because they're going to say, get your house in order first before you are trying to tell us what to do. So I think very frankly, Australia needs to stop the new exploitations and explorations for gas and gold. They need to focus on renewable energy, renewables, because that's really part of the solution, not just for Australia, but for the Pacific. And then the third thing, of course, is to take the leadership on what the global obligations are. The Green Climate Fund and the technology shifting of priorities to the areas that needs to make a difference. I think with that, we can all support. Let me just add to our friend, the United States, and be very frank about it. the United States leadership was not there in the last 4 years. And we were all hoping after Paris that we would see the strong commitment and the strong leadership by the United States, Australia, and all our close friends and partners. But it didn't happen. So this is, again, we're at a crossroad where it's not just the United States, but Australia, Japan, Europe. They need to take the ethical, the moral leadership that must be there in order for others to say, yeah, we have a chance.
Would you like to add something to that, President Tong?
Or just simply to add that I guess we have to address this in a different discussion. But if Australia is going to credibly believe that it's going to wants to host, and in partnership with the Pacific Island countries, whose very livelihood is at stake, then, but if at the same time it continues its coal and gas exports, it would be a very, very clear contradiction. And I think we're not silly enough not to see that, okay? We understand that. Because it's not about hosting the COP. It's about cutting emissions. And this is what the COP must be all about. Cutting emissions so that disaster that is coming can be avoided. It's unfortunate, and I've watched this over the different changes of administrations in different countries, that climate change has been one of the political footballs around, and that is it's very unfortunate. I think Australia, as a people, are coming to understand that can no longer continue to happen. And I'm so happy to see that happening. But at the political level, we need to stop playing that game because lives are at stake.
Indeed. Thank you so much for that. We're going to go to questions from the audience very shortly, but it's such a powerful point that you've made there. And one, hopefully, that is shifting. As you said, we saw a very big political shift at the last election. Right. Australia saw a number of people elected to Parliament on the basis of taking stronger climate action. So there is definitely hope that mood has shifted, and there's now what we've called a climate supermajority in the Parliament. So hopefully the ambition of some of those newly elected people can lift the ambitions of the whole Parliament. The first question that I have is from Aka Vermon, who says, Maori, Tong and Remengesau, if cuts to emissions are inadequate to save our islands, how can we hold global emitters accountable for loss and damage? If I could ask you first, President Remengesau, to answer that one.
Well, this is definitely tied in with the moral responsibility of nations to be able to deliver on what their commitments are. Obviously, we're nowhere close to the targets that have been committed. And so work on the ground, work on the level of the community really has to step up. And that can also involve multilateral or bilateral partnerships. And as I said, the private sector has a lot of role and responsibility to be a part of the equation. There's a tendency to say that it's a global problem and therefore a global fund is needed. But sometimes the sheer bureaucracy, the sheer challenge of addressing and accessing those assistance are just not fast enough nor accurate enough to really focus on the problems of the land. So I think we have to look at it from all perspectives and from all angles. But at the end of the day, it's what is effective, what is efficient to get the people out of their miseries. Because we're not talking about prevention. We're actually talking about adaptation and mitigation and loss of damage. Those are the three things that are already people are drowning and need help in.
President Tong, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, most certainly. I would like to make a few comments. Yeah, of course, there is no existing legal regime to hold these people to account. And that is very unfortunate because the international legal system does not address that. But imagine being in Australia. If you were doing something like that in Australia, there would be some piece of legislation to hold you to account. But of course, this continues to be elusive at the international level. So, and it continues to be evasive because of the pressures coming from the different interest groups. As a region, the Pacific are supporting an initiative by the government of Vanuatu to seek an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. Okay, it will not penalize. It is not a way to find a way to penalize those countries who are continuing to emit, but at least it would give at least some legal opinion as to whether it's a good thing or not. Okay, and we are very happy to hear that the Australian government is supporting that initiative. But there is something that is needed because the countries don't have the sufficient moral capacity to do the right thing on their own, especially if they really are not the ones in control, but are being controlled by other interests. And that is a sad reality that we are beginning to hear, beginning to understand that sometimes and I think this is worldwide. I remember listening to the American economist Jeffrey Sachs when he came here in 2018, and he talked about regulatory capture. And what it is when the governments which are supposed to regulate are being captured by the entities they're supposed to regulate. And that is very sad. And so for countries like ours, if we cannot cut emissions, we would have to find somewhere else to go. Okay. And so that raises a different challenge entirely. And so the issue of climate-induced migration is as up and coming, it's inevitable. But yet, there's not sufficient discussion around that at the international level.
I wonder both if either of you have a comment on the awful floods we're seeing in Pakistan at the moment. That's such an immediate impact and so many people displaced, let alone, the loss and damage as we've just talking about.
It's a sad reality, and the frustration and anger comes not because it's a surprise, but because we know this is going to happen. We knew it was going, and it's happening. So science is important, and I think sometimes it's the economic considerations that override the scientific matters. So it's about truth. And it's also about doing the right thing. Unfortunately, people oftentimes showcase the need for economy over, disasters such as what we're witnessing in Pakistan.
Yeah. The next question I've got is from Holly Cronon. She says, in the last year, Palau joined over 120 countries in signing the Global Methane Pledge, while Australia has not. What would your message be, President Remengesau, for the Australian government in reducing potent methane emissions and the importance of that?
Well, it would be a very good leadership example and a role for the big brother Australia to show the world on behalf of the Pacific family that it's doing the right thing.
Excellent. The next question I've got is from Richard Bentley. He says, Australian banks defend their loans to gas and coal companies by claiming they are advising them on pathways to carbon neutrality. Could we establish an equivalent process by which we ensure customers purchasing products have plans to transition to a carbon-free future, or even taxing the exporters to provide assistance to customers in the transition? What are some of the ways that we can tackle some of those elements of civil society that participate in the fossil fuel industry in other ways like finance? President Tong, if I could ask you that one.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's finance has always been the driving power behind all of this. If there was worldwide agreement that no further investment should be directed towards the opening of new coal mines, the digging up of new fossil fuel, then obviously that would go a long way towards pushing the fossil fuel industries not to be able to expand. And so, again, maybe it's a factor of the capitalist system which we seem to have embraced. Okay, it is unfortunate, but capitalism, of course, the greatest dogma is greed is great no matter what. And I think that's been the problem. This insatiable drive for more wealth. Okay, and which is so regrettable that it's so owned by so few. Okay, but at the cost to so many. It is very, very unfortunate. And I've always wondered how we could reverse this, because even our own governments are not able to withstand the pressure that is coming. And so there was some discussion earlier about the chlorofluorocarbons. Okay, that was successful. And the reason I believe is because, one, there was a substitute identified, but more importantly, they didn't have the power that now that we are facing with the fossil fuel industry to resist that. And so here we are. How can we do it? It's maybe the governments are not doing what they should be doing. And how else? I continue to rake my mind how we might get the fossil fuel industry to become more moral. I think we had experience at the global level with the tobacco industry. We are trying to deal with the fossil fuel industry. It's far more powerful.
Let me just add on to the really important consideration of public education, public perception, and the strong need for civil societies and NGOs to really do the research, the data, and the accountability of many of these government actions and announcements and what needs to be done. I think at the end of the day, it's all about really a transparency of how fast or how effective or where we need to go. And many times, especially with small island governments, this kind of information are not necessarily ready or available. And so we need to, again, work together, whether it's the government accounting of it or the civil societies or private sector, to put up the accurate picture and the accurate accountability that our people deserve.
Richie, I might ask you to come in here. Australia obviously has huge gas and coal exports. Our banking system is still very involved in there. What does Australia really have to do to come to grips with this in the short term?
Yeah, it's a big concern in the sense that you have over 100 new fossil fuel projects in Australia. It's about over 70 coal, over 40 gas. And so the pipeline is there. Now, not all those projects will be up and running, but even just taking a handful of those projects and looking at the emissions just in Australia from digging up all that new coal and gas, you're looking at blowing out any budget to maintaining 43%. But the bigger problem is they're still getting finance both from the private sector and from the public sector. Mm-hmm. Now, the Paris Agreement has 3 goals, which the presidents are clearly aware of, having helped negotiate them. One is to reduce emissions. The second is to adapt to the unavoidable impacts. And then the third is to align finance with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And that hasn't really happened. No. And that's not just obviously private companies that put profits first, but even public entities. Mm-hmm. In Australia, we asked there was a question put towards one of the financing agencies, the public financing agencies, Export Finance Australia, and they said that the Paris Agreement didn't really deal with their project financing, and they have since funded numerous fossil fuel projects. This is a public agency. And so this is the problem. The 43% bill that was recently passed did go to some extent in forcing some of these agencies, these public agencies, to at least consider climate change when they make their financing goals. That's a very useful start. It won't be the end of it. They probably will, still factor in how they do business, but it's a start, and it's regulating our financial institutions, public and private, to consider climate change as part of their criteria for financing that I think is essential. And that's something that governments across the world should be looking at doing, both in terms of their financing, but then also the private sector.
Yeah.
The next question that I've got is from David Tran. He says, alongside recommitting to multilateral climate financing mechanisms like the GCF, what role can Australia play in supporting global South-led financing mechanisms such as the Pacific Resilience Facility?
I understand that the present government is looking at that, looking at reviewing its position with regard to providing climate finance. Of course, they need to go back and decide which one, because there is the Green Climate Fund. Do they want to go back into that, or do they want to upscale their contribution towards climate financing in the Pacific alone? Of course, there is no reason why they cannot do both. But the reality is this: the Pacific Island countries need a facility they can access. We have limited capacity to put together the documentation on all of the paperwork that a number of these organizations need, and financial institutions. And it takes us a long time to be able to negotiate finance out of the Green Climate Fund, even what was the Global Environmental Facility. Okay, but if there was a facility which could be more accessible and it's got a shorter bureaucracy than all of these very complicated international financial institutions, it would help tremendously. We need to be able to reach the grassroots so that people are not waiting for a long time just to build something to protect their communities, a seawall or where. And quite often it may come too late. But yes, Australia has I think if it really wants to step up, those are where it might be able to make a contribution. And that's where it's going to be meaningful to the local community.
President Remengesau, I might ask this next question of you. It's from Grace Mannings, and she asks, how can we support developing economies towards improving their renewable energy capabilities and to transition away from reliance on fossil fuels?
Yes, a very realistic and needed question. And I believe I alluded to that earlier. First of all, the policies of the land have got to focus on renewables. That's the mandate that we need all governments to say. So most island governments have a target by 2025 that reach 25%, 40%. But at the end of the day, it's not just support from Green Climate Fund that necessarily gets the job done. We are really encouraging and promoting public-private partnerships. This is an area where many of the corporations in Australia and throughout the world can begin to come to the communities, island communities, and apply the technologies that are relevant, very efficient, and less costly to the island governments. That would go a long way to providing the needed capital. Again, we are depending so much on Asian development banks and world banks, and governments are incurring debts left and right to do the infrastructure that has been destroyed by the impacts of climate change. And renewable energy is really the way forward for a less costly government, a less costly livelihood, and really a sustainable future for the island communities. Because we're talking about our culture, we're talking about traditions, we're talking about our way of life, we're talking about the ocean that we depend so much, and the ocean is the most impacted by climate change forces. So it's our economy. So if I can just get the understanding across that you don't have to just give us money to do this, encourage one or two energy company to come to the islands, they will make a very good example of what can be done effectively with the most positive impact to the public.
The next question I've got is from Dylan Quinnell, who asks about I've got two different questions. Both are essentially about Australia's new 43% emissions reduction target. And I guess the limitations of that exceeding that target to something like what the science demands, is often derided in Australia as being more of a political target aligned with a particular political party or other, rather than being science driven. What does that 43% emissions reduction target mean for the Pacific?
Well, it doesn't, as I said, I think earlier, and I've said throughout our visit, it doesn't go far enough to ensuring that, guaranteeing that our grandchildren, my grandchildren, will be able to be guaranteed a future. And the question really is the reduction of 43%. How is it being counted? Okay, we must ask that question as well. Does it include counting what credits are being cross-credited over? Okay, because otherwise it becomes just a posturing move. And we understand that politics is important, but if politics is no longer relevant to the realities of what it is that we are facing, I mean, maybe Australia can continue to function. But as I said earlier, countries like ours in the Pacific will have been underwater by then. Many of them will not be habitable. And so the question is, are we still in line to meet our 1.5 degree rise in global temperature? I believe not. And so Australia needs to really go much further than that. And I think it's got to be a bit more transparent. The science is very clear. And so I'm sure your government understands that. But of course, your people may not be fully conversant with how the numbers are being used to transmit a message. But from our perspective, it does not guarantee the safety of our future generations.
President Remengesau, would you like to add anything to that when it comes to targets?
It's a good start. 43% is a good start, but it should not stop at 43%. And frankly, we're encouraged by members of the parliament who said this is only a start. But I guess it remains to be seen as to when the subsequent legislation really addresses this problem. And we're looking at many of the research reports for us, and it's interesting, amazing actually, that support and subsidies to gas and coal alone are in the neighborhood of $10 billion. So that's a mind-boggling figures, and I think from some of the discussions with the members of the parliament, it's definitely money that could also be shifted to addressing renewable energy and really begin to address the win-win situation that we're all asking for.
If I might ask a bit of a cheeky question before we finish up, we've recently seen the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II and the beginning of the reign of King Charles III. Both of you served multiple terms and had extensive careers in politics. Any reflection on such a long reign for the monarch, or on King Charles and his well-known advocacy for climate change action?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, we definitely send our condolences and respect to the Queen. She has been a worldwide figure of dignity and stability and leadership. And I think that's a character that we all want from our leader. At King Richard, Charles is really a friend of the small island nations, because many of the things that we've heard him address, climate change and other ocean or climate change forums, have really been inclusive, I should say. For instance, he talked about pollution in the ocean with plastic, and how the microplastic DNA is actually the one of the hazards, or one of the dangers for the world, and for those of us who eat fish in our diet. It is very concerning that our fish are eating DNA plastics, and therefore it's not going to be conducive to our good health in the long run. So he is somebody that we are very much in support of, with his strong position and support for climate change, and especially not just for developed nations, but the people most affected by climate change.
President Tong, would you like to add anything?
Most certainly, most certainly. We, of course, extend our condolences to the people of the United Kingdom, the family of the late Queen. Of course, you Australians also as your former head of state, and of course she's been such an epitome of grace. I've had the pleasure of meeting Her Majesty on more than one occasion, and it's always amazing how she can make. She seems to be a bright light in the middle of wherever she is, and that's always been the impression that I've made of Her Majesty. The transfer of the monarchy to King Charles is a welcome one. I suppose it was always expected that it would happen one day, and the question is, are we ready for it? And the question is he ready for it? And I know there's been talk around different regions of the Commonwealth about moving away from having the King of England as monarch, as head of state in the different countries. Here in Australia, I know you've been examining that. This is not the right time to be talking about it. I understand that. But yet these are the realities that we will face in the days ahead. And of course, King Charles III is, before he became the monarch, had always been a very strong advocate for the environment and climate change. I had the opportunity to interact with him on this, and he's always been very strong on these issues. And listening to his opening statement on becoming king, he indicated that he will be stepping down from some of these commitments. And I don't think climate change advocacy should be one of the ones that he stepped down, because it's a lifeblood for people, not just in our part of the world, but here in Australia. You need all of the advocacy that you need, especially now that he's become the head of state, not just of the United Kingdom, but those countries that continue to have the monarch in the United Kingdom as head of state. I would like to challenge him to say, stay on board, please. We need you on board so that we can deal with this vexing issue of climate change.
And of course, that shouldn't really be political, should it?
No, not at all.
I might just ask you to have a few reflections. It was the Glasgow COP that I think really made a lot of headway when it comes to tackling, I guess, the methane pledge that we've already talked about, as well as coal and the supply of coal kind of a bit more head on. I think I've got, I don't know if people can see here, some photos of you from the last COP15 back in Paris, where you were launching that global moratorium on coal mines with our executive director, Richard Dennis there, and Kumi Naidu from Greenpeace. I just wondered if, just to bring us home, some reflections on how far we've come from Paris to Glasgow. Are we making some headway at least?
Definitely, we have made progress, I think. But the masses have joined the campaign. That's definitely the case. And especially the young people. This is very, very encouraging. The young people need to come on board on this one. But we continue to be some distance away from where we need to be. And for the simple reason that we're still not tapping not pressing the right buttons, okay? Because as I said earlier, we need to be able to communicate and somehow we make an impact on the multinational corporations who are actually responsible for this and who are the power behind manipulating us away from these targets that we need to be. And so that is where we are at the moment. We're still nowhere near reassuring ourselves that, certainly for us, that we will have I've got more than 20 grandchildren. Okay. And I cannot tell them when I get back that, yes, now we can be assured that you'll still have this home. So far, the indications are they will have to find a new home as they grow up.
Yeah, just very quickly, I wish we would be at a better situation or status quo than we need to be, because it's certainly not enough. But having said that, I think my frustrations and my hopelessness are kind of balanced with my faith for the young people. I truly have hope if there's somebody who's going to rightfully address the situation. It's really the next generation, because it's their future, it's their children and grandchildren's future, and they will eventually make the decisions on a moral and integrity and responsible manner. So far, everything is all about the debate between economy and climate change, and I think that's the reason why we're slow.
Yeah. Look, thank you both so much for your time. His Excellency Anote Tong, former president of Kiribati, His Excellency Tommy Remengesau Jr., former president of Palau, Richard Dennis, Executive Director at the Australia Institute, and my colleague Richie Merzian, head of our Climate and Energy Program. Thank you everyone for your great questions. Thank you also to the Pacific Elders Voice and the Edmund Rice Centre for their support for this event. Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks again for your time, His Excellencies, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
From PBB.
Bye.
Bye.
This has been a special webinar episode of Follow the Money. All our webinars are free and available on the Australia Institute's YouTube channel at australiainstitute.tv. And you can find us on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a NNT, and our podcast producer is at Jennifer Macy, with additional editing from Emily Perkins. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Thanks for listening.